York, the Big Apple, the concrete jungle, the city of dreams, you get the point. When it comes to hockey in New York, you probably think the Rangers were the first NHL team in New York. Well, you're wrong. A year before the Rangers came into the NHL, another team called New York home. That team was the New York/Brooklyn Americans. Play the intro. As you may remember from my last video on Eddie Livingstone, the NHL started only with teams in Canada. That was until 1924, when the Boston Bruins became the first American NHL team. Then in April of that same year, New York was awarded a franchise. The owners of this new team were Canadian sports promoter Thomas Dugan and infamous New York bootlegger and mobster Big Bill Dwyer. Dugan was the public face, but Dwyer was the true owner. Dwyer christened the team as the Americans, most likely as a way to attract fans with a patriotic feel, and as the polar opposite of the Montreal Canadiens. Instead of getting players from an expansion draft, Dwyer bought players from the Hamilton Tigers, who were recently kicked out of the NHL for going on strike. The Americans joined the NHL along with the Pittsburgh Pirates, not those Pirates, in 1925. Even though they were in first place as the Tigers the year prior, the Americans stumbled and finished their inaugural season 12-20-4. Despite the mediocre record, they were a hit at the box office, drawing in huge crowds. Hockey was catching a lot of attention in New York. It even caught the attention of Madison Square Garden president Tex Rickard, who decided to form his own team, the New York Rangers. In theory, it seemed like a good idea. New York is a big city that can support two teams, and an epic battle of New York looks awesome for a league that is still developing. In reality, this was bad news for the Americans. There was an option in the Americans' arena lease that allowed Rickard to form his own team. Originally, Rickard told Dwyer he wouldn't use it, but after seeing the success of the Americans, Rickard lied to Dwyer and formed the Rangers. The Rangers owned MSG and the Americans were the tenant. With the creation of the Rangers and two other American teams, the Chicago Blackhawks and Detroit Cougars, two divisions were created. To the misfortune of the Americans and either poor planning by the NHL or no other options, the Americans were placed in the Canadian division along with the Canadian teams. The Rangers, on the other hand, were placed in the American division with the other American teams. The Americans' second season was worse, 17-25-2. The Rangers, on the other hand, experienced quite the success, winning their division in their first season. The season after that was a punch in the gut. The Americans finished the season last in the division and second to last in the league. What did the Rangers do? They won the Stanley Cup, nothing too crazy. The Americans needed to fix this, so they signed goalie Roy Waters from Pittsburgh. He became a god and carried the Americans to second in the division with a 19-13-12 record and their first ever playoff berth. Because of the playoff system back then, the Americans, ironically, faced their crosstown rival and landlord, the Rangers, in the playoffs. Also back then, the quarterfinals were decided by total goals. This system is called aggregate. You might have seen it in soccer. Anyway, in Game 1, both teams went scoreless. And by scoreless, I mean as in nobody scored. Game 1 ended in a 0-0 tie. Game 2 felt more like a winner-take-all Game 7. It picked up where it started, with both teams going ice-cold on offense. Game 2 needed overtime. 2 overtimes to be exact. And with 10 seconds left until triple overtime, Butch Keeling scored the game winner for the Rangers, knocking out the Americans. The next season proved that the previous one was a fluke. Just like the stock market in 1929, the Americans crashed and fell. They were welcomed back to the basement of the Canadian division with an abysmal 14-25-5 record. The season after that, the Americans did finish above 500 with an 18-16-10 record. They had the same amount of points as the Montreal Maroons with 46. However, Montreal finished with 2 more wins, eliminating New York via tiebreaker. The Americans were saddled with more sub-500 records throughout the 30s. But it wasn't just the on-ice performance that was the problem. Off the ice, there were issues as well. On December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, which repealed the 18th Amendment. Prohibition was no more. What this meant was bootleggers like our good friend Big Bill Dwyer were in trouble. His main source of money was bootlegging and illegally selling alcohol, and without prohibition, that meant less money, if any. Dwyer was not only having trouble with money, but the United States government was on his tail. The US government had won a big lawsuit against him, which basically left him broke. He had tried to merge the Americans with the equally struggling Ottawa Senators, but the NHL wouldn't allow it. Dwyer had no choice but to surrender the team to player-coach turned manager Red Dutton. Also in the 35-36 season, the Americans returned to the playoffs for the first time in 7 years. They faced the Blackhawks in the quarterfinals. The stupid aggregate system was still in effect. The Americans won Game 1 3-0. Chicago won Game 2 5-4, but thanks to the total goal system, New York won the series by a final score of 7-5. The Americans had won their first ever playoff series. In the best-of-3 semifinals, the Americans faced the Toronto Maple Leafs. Toronto won Game 1 3-1. New York shut out Toronto 1-0 in Game 2. In a deciding Game 3, the Maple Leafs would upend the Americans with a 3-1 win. Just before the next season, the NHL would take control of the Americans. Dwyer sued the NHL, and as a settlement, the league would allow Dwyer to keep the team if he could figure out his debts. Dutton had also given Bill $20,000 for the team, but Dwyer immediately lost at gambling on a craps game. New York also fell apart with a 15-29-4 record to finish last in the league. The Americans bounced back the next year with a 19-18-11 record and snuck into the playoffs. In the playoffs, with the real best-of-3 series this time, the Americans faced their crosstown foes, the Rangers, once again. In Game 1, the Americans won in double overtime 2-1. In Game 2, the Rangers evened the series with a 4-3 win. Winner-take-all Game 3 needed overtime, but unlike 1929, this year was different. In the fourth overtime, Lorne Carl scored the game-winning goal. The Americans got their revenge on the Rangers. In the semifinals, the Americans faced the Blackhawks. The Americans won Game 1 3-1, which made them one win away from their first Cup final appearance. But it wasn't meant to be. The Blackhawks took Game 2 in double overtime and edged out the Americans in Game 3 by a score of 3-2 to win the series. The Americans would make the playoffs in the next 2 seasons, but were swept by the Maple Leafs and edged out by the Red Wings respectively. In the midst of this, World War II began. Players left the ice for military service. This decimated hockey rosters. The Americans were hit hard. To make matters worse, they were stuck with debt from Mr. Dwyer and were forced to sell any good players they had left. The Americans finished dead last with a historically awful 8-29-11 record. The next year, Red Dutton, who was basically holding the team together with whatever he could find, renamed them to the Brooklyn Americans. Dutton had plans to move the Americans out of Madison Square Garden and to an arena in Brooklyn. Except there was no suitable arena for the team, so they were stuck at MSG. They finished in last place with a somewhat better 16-29-3 record. With American soldiers also in the war, the Americans had no choice but to suspend operations. The NHL promised Dutton they would bring back the Americans when the war ended. In 1945, an ownership group came with a proposal to build an arena in Brooklyn with the intention of bringing back the Americans. Except the NHL rejected it and refused to reinstate the team, officially listing the Americans as folded as of 1942. Dutton was livid. He blamed the owners of Madison Square Garden as to why the NHL wouldn't bring back the Americans. As a result, he stated that the Rangers, the Americans' crosstown rival, the team that butted in the Americans' way, the team that won the championships the Americans never did, wouldn't win a Stanley Cup for the rest of his life. It turns out he was right. The Rangers never won a Stanley Cup while Dutton was alive. They would sniff the finals 3 times but lost all 3 times. The chance of 1940 from the New York Islanders, their new crosstown rival and de facto replacement for the Americans, rang throughout Rangers fans' heads. In 1988, Dutton passed away. 6 years later, the Rangers won the Stanley Cup, breaking the curse. The Rangers would make the finals 2 decades later, but lost in 5 games to the Kings. Today, the Rangers are one of the strongest teams in the league. With goaltending rock Igor Shesterkin, the possibilities for the Rangers are high. and they wanted to push out a crosstown rival. As for Brooklyn, they would get the chance to house an NHL team. Starting in 2015, the Islanders started playing home games at Barclays Center in Brooklyn. And it wasn't like the proposed arena in 1945. The setup was a mess, and the Islanders were on the verge of leaving the island for places unknown. But they got a new arena and will not be in danger of moving. Now in terms of Brooklyn getting an NHL team, that is very unlikely. The New York metropolitan area is overstocked with the Rangers, Islanders, Buffalo Sabres, and if you count them, the New Jersey Devils. As forgotten as the Americans are, they are a predecessor. Even though their history has been forgotten by many, they were the first NHL team in New York. They should be remembered for that. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Today's shoutout goes to Serenity Styles. I'll see you in the next video.